The fog came early that morning, swallowing the cobblestone lanes of Coldbridge village until even the steeple of St. Mary's vanished into the mist. Gas lamps struggled to burn against the damp air, their glow reduced to trembling halos of gold. In that silence, a single set of footsteps echoed, steady, deliberate, measured. They belonged to a woman in a dark wool coat, her bonnet tied neatly beneath her chin. Her name was Agnes Wren, the midwife of Coldbridge. For almost 20 years, Agnes had been present at nearly every birth in the valley. She had seen life begin in the poorest cottages and the grandest estates. She knew the cries of mothers, the warmth of a newborn's first breath, and the fragile quiet that sometimes followed, the one that broke even the strongest of hearts. Her voice was calm, her hands sure. She never failed to come when called. That morning, her knock sounded against the door of the Bennets, a young couple new to the village. Their home, the old miller's house, sat at the edge of the moor, where the fog never seemed to lift. Inside, the air smelled of sweat, candle wax and wood smoke. The woman, pale and trembling, lay on the bed, her cries sharp as the wind rattling the shutters. "Shh," Agnes murmured, her voice low, patient. "It will pass soon, my dear." The baby arrived just as dawn touched the window. A weak but steady cry rose into the room. Agnes smiled faintly, a small, private expression, and wrapped the infant in a linen cloth, humming a tune too old to place. The mother's breathing slowed, her exhaustion claiming her. When the husband returned with the village doctor, the room was empty. The fire still burned, the midwife was gone. So was the child. At first, no one questioned her. Agnes was gentle, devoted, a familiar figure who carried the scent of lavender and smoke wherever she went. When tragedy struck, a stillbirth here, a cradle death there, she was the one who offered comfort. Her calm voice had guided the grieving through sleepless nights. Yet that winter, the stories began to twist. 3 infants were said to have died within a month of their birth. 2 more were never seen again after Agnes's visits. The official records, penned by the parish clerk, cited natural causes. But grief has its own memory, and it began to whisper. Mothers spoke in hushed tones of strange dreams, of hearing their lost children cries outside their windows, of seeing a lantern moving across the moor long after midnight. One woman, Eliza Cartwright, said she had followed the sound herself. "It came from the river," she told the vicar, voice trembling. "A baby crying, faint but clear. And I swear, Reverend, I saw her, Agnes, standing in the water up to her knees, her skirts soaked, holding nothing at all." The Reverend dismissed it as delirium. Yet something about Eliza's eyes, the haunted conviction behind them, unsettled him. By spring, Coldbridge had changed. People still called for Agnes. Who else would they trust to bring a child into the world? But when she came to their doors, the fathers stood guard, watching her hands, her eyes. They still thanked her politely, still offered tea, but the warmth was gone. Inside her cottage near the chapel, Agnes lived in a quiet solitude. The shutters were always drawn, the fire low. On a narrow shelf sat a row of small wooden boxes, each carved with initials, some with dates. Inside them were trinkets, a lock of hair, a ribbon, a silver rattle, a button from a christening gown. She kept them clean, dusting each one gently, her fingers trembling. Sometimes she would whisper to them, as if speaking to someone listening from the other side. No one knew where she had come from. The oldest villagers remembered her arrival years ago, a stranger walking through the fog, carrying a doctor's satchel and a folded letter. She claimed to be a widow from Bath, but no one ever saw her mourn. There were no graves bearing her name, no kin who came to visit, only her work and her silence. Then came the 8th child. It was a stormy night in May when the Lambton baby went missing. The mother had fallen asleep beside the cradle, exhausted after 3 days of labor. When she awoke, the cradle was empty, the window open, and the faint outline of footprints led across the mud to the riverbank. They ended abruptly at the edge of the water. By morning, a search had begun. Villagers combed the reeds and dragged the shallows, but no body was found. What they did find was a small silver rattle, one Agnes herself had given to the child days earlier. The whispers became accusations. A petition was drawn up demanding the vicar speak with her. When Reverend Samuel Harker arrived at her cottage, he found her by the fire, reading scripture. She looked up at him, calm as ever, and offered tea. "I only wish to ask about the Lambton child," he said. Agnes didn't answer at first. She traced her finger along the rim of her teacup, then looked at him with eyes that seemed older than she was. "Some are meant to stay," she said softly, "and some are called back." The words sent a chill through him. He asked again about the boxes, about the footprints, about the nights she was seen near the river. Her hands tightened in her lap. "You think I took them?" she whispered. "You think I would harm what I brought into this world?" The vicar said nothing. Agnes stood, walking to the shelf. She touched one of the boxes, the one marked E.M., Eliza's lost child. "They're not gone, Reverend," she said. "Not truly. Some things you can't see unless you've lost something yourself." That night, as he returned to the vicarage, Harker couldn't shake the sound that followed him, the faint creak of a door, the hush of distant weeping, the river's slow whisper. And as he looked back, he thought he saw a light in the window of Agnes's cottage, a flickering glow that swayed like a cradle rocking in the dark. By dawn, the mist had thickened again. The village slept uneasy, and somewhere near the river, a single lantern light bobbed once, then vanished beneath the fog. The day Agnes Wren vanished began like any other in Coldbridge. The fog had rolled in again, heavy and low, smothering the rooftops and creeping into every alley. Milk froze in its pail. Crows watched from the chapel's belfry, their black wings shivering against the pale sky. It was April, but the air still carried the bite of winter, a season reluctant to die. Inside St. Mary's, Reverend Harker stood before the altar, his candle flickering, as he tried to read the sermon notes he'd written the night before. The ink had smudged. His hands still shook from the visit to Agnes's cottage days earlier. He had told no one of their conversation, not even the constable. Yet the words, "Some are called back," echoed in his thoughts with every toll of the church bell. The villagers, meanwhile, had begun to act on their own. Fear, once whispered behind closed doors, had turned to action. At the grocer's, women gathered in murmuring circles, clutching their shawls as they spoke of strange lights near the riverbank and sounds like crying beneath the ground. The men, wary but restless, spoke of searching Agnes's cottage for the sake of the children. No one admitted aloud what they truly wanted. Proof. Proof that would explain what their grief could not. It was Thomas Ray, the blacksmith, who led them. He had lost his own son the previous autumn, a stillborn child, delivered by Agnes herself. When he'd asked for the body to bury, she told him it had been taken to the parish doctor for study, yet no such doctor had ever arrived in Coldbridge. His grief had simmered into quiet fury. By late afternoon, 5 men approached the cottage at the edge of the village. Its shutters were closed, smoke still rising faintly from the chimney. No answer came when they knocked. Thomas forced the door open with the butt of his lantern. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of herbs and ash. A fire burned low, casting long, restless shadows across the walls. Rows of glass jars lined the shelves, dried roots, folded cloths, bottles labelled in Agnes's careful hand. But what caught their eyes was the cradle in the corner. Empty, rocking slightly as if someone had just risen from beside it. "Search the place," Thomas said. They opened cupboards, lifted rugs, even pried loose the wooden chest beneath her bed. Beneath a pile of linen, they found a small collection of ledgers, old parish records, written in ink, so faded the words were barely legible. Births, deaths, baptisms. But one of the ledgers was newer, the handwriting unmistakably hers. Inside, under neat headings, were lists of names, all infants. Some crossed out, some circled. Beside certain entries were strange markings, a small cross, a spiral, a pair of initials that didn't match any known family. And on the final page, a single sentence written in trembling ink, "They will not return until they are whole." The men stared, unsure of its meaning. But beneath the ledger, hidden between the boards of the floor, they found something else, a small wooden box. Inside lay a lock of pale hair tied with blue ribbon, a baby's rattle, and a note folded in half. It read, "Forgive me. I could not let them go to the dark alone." The room seemed to tighten around them. Thomas's jaw set. "She's taken them," he whispered. "All of them." That night the village gathered in the chapel. Reverend Harker stood at the pulpit, the ledger open before him, his voice trembling as he read the names aloud. Mothers wept quietly. Fathers clenched their fists. The air was thick with grief and shame. Shame for trusting her, shame for doubting her too late. At the back of the church, a sudden gust of wind blew open the door. Everyone turned. The fog had thickened outside, but for a moment a faint light flickered within it, the wavering glow of a lantern moving through the mist. Someone gasped. "She's out there." Thomas Ray grabbed his coat. "Then we finish this tonight." They followed the light through the graveyard, past the leaning stones, slick with moss. The lantern's glow bobbed ahead of them, vanishing and reappearing like a will-o'-the-wisp. Down the narrow path toward the river they went, their boots sinking into the wet earth. When they reached the water's edge, the light stopped. There, half submerged in the reeds, was Agnes's satchel. Inside it, a bundle of cloth soaked through and a small brass cross from the chapel altar. But no sign of her. The river flowed silent, black as oil. "Maybe she drowned," said one man. "No," murmured Thomas. "She's not gone." They searched until dawn, but the fog swallowed everything. When the first light came, all that remained were footprints, dozens of them, leading away from the river and back toward the chapel. But they weren't adult prints. They were small, barefoot, child-sized. The next day, the vicar sealed the chapel doors. He told the parish it was to protect the sanctity of the house of God. But privately, he confessed to his journal that he feared something else had taken root beneath the church, something old and waiting. In the weeks that followed, Coldbridge grew silent. The air in the chapel turned strange, carrying a faint scent of lilies and river mud. Parishioners said they heard crying during evening prayers, faint, rhythmic, almost like the hum of a lullaby. A few refused to attend altogether, claiming the pews felt too cold, as if someone unseen sat beside them. The constable from Hawley came to investigate, a practical man unshaken by superstition. He found the ledgers, questioned the villagers, and concluded that Agnes Wren had simply fled. "A guilty mind," he said, "and perhaps a touch of madness." He ordered her home locked, and the key kept by the parish. But a month later, a boy from the village, chasing his dog through the moor, came upon something buried in the earth, a wooden box, like the ones from Agnes's shelf. Inside, a faded scrap of fabric and a slip of parchment. Written on it in Agnes's hand, "You hear them too, don't you?" By summer, no one spoke her name aloud. The villagers avoided the path near the river and kept their children close after sunset. But every so often, when the wind turned east, they said the bells of St. Mary's rang softly on their own, 3 notes, no more, as though marking the birth of something unseen, and somewhere beneath the floor of the chapel, deep within the stone, the earth stirred. By the time the first snow fell over Coldbridge, the village had learned to live with its silence. The river froze, the fog grew thin, and for a time it seemed as though Agnes Wren had truly gone. Yet even absence has a voice, and in Coldbridge it began to whisper again. Reverend Harker was the first to hear it. He had returned to St. Mary's one late evening to retrieve his Bible, left behind after Sunday service. The air inside the chapel was still, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. But as he reached the altar, he heard it, a faint sound beneath the hymn of the wind, a soft cry, distant yet unmistakable, rising from somewhere below. At first he thought it was an animal trapped under the floorboards. The church was old, its foundations riddled with hollows where mice nested in winter. He knelt, pressed his ear to the cold stone and froze. It was not the sound of scratching or squeaking. It was breathing. Slow, labored, human. The Reverend stumbled back, his lantern flickering. He wanted to believe it was his imagination, born of guilt and fatigue. But when the sound came again, this time joined by a faint hum, a woman's voice singing softly as though to comfort a child, his knees weakened. The tune was familiar. He had heard it once before, hummed by Agnes herself on the day he'd visited her cottage. He fled the chapel and locked the door behind him. The next morning, he told no one, but the memory clung to him like the fog. He avoided the church for days, choosing instead to hold services in the open air. The villagers accepted it as an act of humility, never guessing the true reason. Only his journal bore witness to the truth. "There is something beneath the chapel," he wrote. "Something that remembers." 2 nights later, the caretaker, old Mr. Dobbins, went to check the bell ropes before dawn. When he did not return, his wife found him standing motionless in the nave. His lantern burned out. His eyes were fixed on the altar, his lips trembling. When she asked what had happened, he only whispered, "They were singing." He never entered the church again. By midwinter, Coldbridge had begun to feel haunted not by one woman, but by a presence that filled the air itself. Lamps guttered when prayers were spoken. The choir refused to rehearse, saying the acoustics made their voices echo twice. One echo always arrived a heartbeat late. The constable from Hawley dismissed it all as nerves. But one evening, as he made his rounds near the chapel, he noticed something odd, fresh footprints in the snow, small and barefoot, leading from the church door to the river. They stopped halfway across the frozen bridge and simply ended. That same night, the vicar's journal described hearing the sound again, closer this time, beneath the pulpit. "The cries are louder," he wrote, "and the lullaby has changed. She no longer sings to them. She sings for herself." Driven by fear and duty, Harker decided to investigate. With 2 of the parish men, he pried open a section of the floor near the altar. Beneath the stone lay a narrow passage, hidden for decades. The air that rose from it was damp and cold, thick with the scent of earth and something sweeter, flowers perhaps, or decay. They lowered a lantern into the darkness and saw what looked like the top of an old staircase, descending into the foundations. No one wanted to go down, but Harker insisted. "If she's there," he said, "then we will lay her to rest." The steps creaked beneath their weight as they descended. The tunnel was low, the air stale. At the bottom, they found a small crypt, long sealed, its walls lined with carved stones. In the center lay an altar of rough wood, and upon it a single object, a cradle. Empty, save for a folded scrap of linen, the Reverend reached for it, his hands trembling. The cloth was embroidered with a name, Eleanor Wren, dated 30 years earlier. The lantern sputtered. Somewhere above, the church bell tolled once, though no one was left to ring it. The men ran, abandoning the lantern in the crypt. They sealed the passage and swore never to speak of it. Yet within days the sound returned. Only now it came not from below, but from the walls themselves. Parishioners sitting in the pews swore they could hear faint knocking between the stones, as if someone were moving inside them. The cries of infants, muffled but insistent, blending with the hum of the wind. Reverend Harker's sermons grew erratic. He preached of sin and salvation, of life stolen and returned. He urged the villagers to repent, to purify themselves, to confess what they had hidden. "The children remember," he said one Sunday, voice breaking. And so does she. Many stopped attending after that. Some moved away altogether. In early February, the river thawed. Ice broke along the banks, and with it came a discovery that changed everything. A fisherman named Clay found a bundle caught between the reeds, a linen cloth bound with twine. Inside was a small wooden box, identical to those from Agnes's cottage. But this one was new, the wood unweathered. Inside, a folded piece of paper read, "They are almost ready." That night the fog returned thicker than ever. From the hill above the village, lights were seen moving inside the chapel, dozens of them, like candles carried by unseen hands. The bell tolled again, not once but 3 times. Those who heard it swore the sound did not echo outward into the moor, but downward, deep into the earth. By morning, the door to St. Mary's was open. The pews were overturned, hymn books scattered. The altar cloth was torn in 2, and beneath the floorboards near the pulpit, a section of stone had been lifted. The vicar was gone. In his study, they found his final journal entry. Written hours before his disappearance, "She came to me in the night, not as a ghost, but as a mother. She said the river had given them back, and now the church must keep them. She asked me to listen, and I did. The sound was beautiful. It was breathing. After that night, the chapel was abandoned. Coldbridge slowly emptied, its few remaining families moving north to safer parishes. The fog took the rest. But some nights, when the wind cuts across the moor, travellers claim to see a faint light moving along the riverbank, a lantern swinging gently, as if carried by a hand unseen. And if one stands close enough to the chapel ruins, the sound still comes through the earth, not a scream, not quite a song, but the gentle rhythm of a lullaby, long forgotten. It is said the voice hums only 3 notes, soft and mournful, before fading into silence, and if you listen too closely, you might almost hear the words between them. Hush now. They are sleeping. Time, like fog, erases gently but never completely. By the middle of the 20th century, Coldbridge existed only as a name on a parish map, a small dot among the moors between Hawley and the coast. Travellers who passed that way said there was nothing to see, only broken stones, the remains of St. Mary's Chapel, and the whisper of water beneath the bridge that gave the place its name. Yet for some, that silence was an invitation. In 1962, the Essex Historical Preservation Society commissioned a survey of derelict religious sites across rural England. Among them was Coldbridge, long forgotten, marked as abandoned, potentially unstable, of low historical value. The assignment fell to Dr. Jonathan Keane, an architectural historian with a fascination for churches that had swallowed their own stories. He arrived in November, armed with a tape recorder, a camera, and a curiosity that would soon curdle into fear. His report began with simple observations. Structure largely intact. Nave roof collapsed. Bell missing. Stonework late Georgian, with early Norman foundation. But as he explored the site, Keane noticed something that made him pause. In the foundation stones, barely visible beneath a crust of moss, was a faint engraving, a spiral pattern identical to the ones found in Agnes Wren's ledger decades before. The spiral was not decorative. It was carved deliberately, deep and deliberate, as though marking a boundary rather than adorning it. Beneath it, written in Latin so eroded it was almost invisible, were the words "Sic redunt," thus they return. That night, Keane camped inside the ruins, determined to record atmospheric sound for his research. The wind moaned through the broken arches, and rain pattered against the stone. Around midnight, the tape caught something strange, a faint rhythmic sound beneath the hiss of static. Steady, pulsing, like the echo of distant breathing. At first, Keane assumed it was his own heartbeat amplified by the recorder's sensitivity. But when he played the tape back, the rhythm continued long after he'd stopped moving. Then between the pulses, a voice, faint, feminine, almost a sigh, hummed 3 notes, the same sequence repeated softly again and again. He noted in his journal, "Recording interference. Unclear if environmental, human-like in tone, pattern recurring at 0.3 Hz intervals. Feels almost maternal." The next night, he left the recorder running in the nave and slept outside under a tarpaulin. When he retrieved the tape in the morning, the sound was different. The hum had deepened into something almost melodic, a lullaby, distorted but recognizable. Over it, the faint cries of infants could be heard, echoing as though from far below the earth. The archivist, who later listened to the tapes, described the sound as a choir of children singing underwater. Keane's journal entries grew increasingly agitated. The ground moves at night, not visibly, but it feels alive, as though the soil itself is exhaling. The air is colder near the altar stone. There's something beneath it. He decided to excavate the area near the pulpit where the earlier parish records mentioned the hidden crypt. Working alone, he removed the loose stones and uncovered a narrow shaft descending into darkness. The smell that rose from it was thick, iron and lilies. By lamplight he climbed down. The passage was narrow, the walls slick with condensation. At the bottom lay a chamber no larger than a cellar. Its floor was uneven, covered in damp earth. And in the center, arranged in a perfect circle, were small wooden boxes, dozens of them. Each was marked with a child's name, burned into the lid. Some dated from the 1880s. Others were newer. One lay open. Inside was a yellowed piece of paper, the handwriting shaky but unmistakable. Do not fear the crying. It means they remember. Keane fled. He left his equipment behind, driving through the night until he reached the nearest post office, where he mailed his journal and tapes to the Essex Historical Society with a single note. Do not return there. Let them rest. He was never seen again. Weeks later, the tapes were catalogued by a junior archivist named Margaret Hill, who found them oddly beautiful. Haunting, yes, but strangely calming. She made copies for analysis. When she played them in her office, her colleagues complained of feeling faint, describing pressure in their ears, as though the air itself thickened. One man claimed to hear his own child's voice, whispering his name. The recordings were sealed in the Society's restricted collection, labeled the Coldbridge Reels. For decades they gathered dust, until a BBC producer discovered them while researching haunted locations in the 1980s. In 1987, The Forgotten Villages of England aired a short segment on Coldbridge. It featured excerpts of Keane's audio, describing it as an unexplained acoustic phenomenon. Viewers reported hearing additional sounds that the broadcast didn't include. A woman's voice whispering their own names. Faint but distinct, complaints poured in. The tape was pulled from re-airing. By then, Coldbridge had already become legend, the village that birthed its own echo. Amateur ghost hunters and thrill-seekers began visiting the ruins, recording their own tapes. Most caught nothing but wind. But one recording, made in 1992 by two students from Bristol, captured something clearer, a lullaby sung in a woman's voice, accompanied by soft knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, like the sound of a cradle rocking. Their footage ends abruptly. When police recovered their equipment days later, it showed the chapel ruins exactly as before, except for one detail. The altar stone, long cracked and fallen, had been moved back into place, as if someone had sealed the ground beneath. After that, the site was declared unsafe and closed to the public. Signs were posted, danger, unstable ground. But locals say the signs never stay standing for long. By morning, they are always found lying face down, covered in wet earth, as if someone had lifted them in the night and gently set them down again. And sometimes, on cold winter evenings, when the fog rolls through the valley and the moonlight hits the stones just right, a sound rises from beneath the grass, a hum so soft it might be mistaken for the wind. 3 notes, always the same. Those who hear it say it stirs something deep inside them, a warmth mixed with sorrow, like remembering a song you knew as a child but can't recall the words to. And somewhere, they say, a woman's voice still whispers through the moor, patient and eternal, as if comforting something that never grew old and never quite died. Hush now. The crying will stop soon. By the time the 21st century arrived, Coldbridge existed only in whispers and archives. The village was long gone, consumed by the moors and by the silence it had earned. Its ruins were known to historians, folklorists, and a handful of paranormal researchers who treated it as little more than a curiosity. Another ghost story set against England's endless grey hills. But the story wasn't finished. It was only sleeping. In 2009, a team of digital archivists at the British Sound Library began a project to remaster forgotten field recordings from the mid-20th century. Among the reels sent to them from regional collections were a set marked Seabridge, 1962, Dr. J. Keane. They had lain untouched for nearly 50 years, their metal cases cold and dust-coated. The archivists digitized the tapes, expecting little more than background hiss and static. But as the waveforms appeared on their screens, one of them, Emily Rhodes, a young acoustic analyst, noticed something unusual. The recordings contained rhythmic patterns too precise to be random noise. She increased the gain, filtered the background, and froze. Between the soft pulses of wind and static, a woman's voice emerged. It was faint, drawn out, almost melodic. 3 notes, then a pause. 3 more. The same lullaby, repeating with mathematical precision. Beneath it, other frequencies trembled, low, near the edge of human hearing, like the slow beating of a heart. Emily sent the file to her supervisor, who laughed it off as coincidence. "Old tape flutter," he said. "It's just mechanical error." But that night, when Emily replayed the file at home, she noticed something new. Another voice. A whisper that hadn't been audible before. It wasn't the woman. It was a child answering. She slowed the playback and listened carefully. The words were distorted, incomplete. A single phrase repeated between the lullaby's phrases, soft and blurred but unmistakable. "We remember you." Over the next week, she became obsessed. She compared the 1962 tapes with later copies from the 1980s. The waveform patterns didn't match. They had changed. The lullaby had shifted key. It was evolving. Her notes, found later on her computer, recorded her growing unease. Audio frequencies consistent with voice, female, late 30s. Underlayer shows multiple harmonic structures. Infant vocal range detected between 250–450 Hz. Voices not archival. They respond to playback. Impossible. At 3:02 mark, whisper audible, "Don't turn it off." Emily isolated the whisper and sent it to a forensic sound engineer. His reply was brief. "The voice is yours." She stopped responding to messages 3 days later. Her computer was still on when they found her flat, the speakers humming faintly. The file on the screen was open but silent. When played later by technicians, the file contained nothing but low static, until the very end, when 3 notes sounded. The same lullaby. News of her death revived interest in the legend of Coldbridge. Podcasts, forums, and amateur researchers dissected the story, linking it to the lost village and its infamous midwife. But among those who listened to the tapes, something strange happened. Each reported hearing something slightly different. One man claimed to hear a woman calling his name. Another, the sound of a baby laughing. A historian from Durham heard her late mother's voice, reciting a prayer she hadn't spoken since childhood. Yet when they compared their files, the recordings were identical. The sound, it seemed, reflected what each listener carried within them. By 2015, the recordings had gone viral under the name The Coldbridge Lullaby. Most who heard it dismissed it as a hoax, clever editing, pareidolia, the human tendency to find meaning in noise. But a small group of acoustic researchers noticed a detail others missed. When analyzed visually, the frequencies formed not random waves, but a repeating spiral, identical to the carvings found beneath St. Mary's Chapel decades earlier. And within that spiral, at the very center of the pattern, was a phrase rendered in spectrographic letters. Thus they return. When the discovery was published, the British Sound Library removed the files from public access. But by then, hundreds of copies had already circulated online. Some versions were only a few seconds long, others extended into hours. All contained the same melody, the same pattern of breath and voice. And in every version, new layers began to appear, whispers that hadn't been there before. Those who listened to it through headphones described the same sensation: warmth in the chest, a tightening behind the eyes, and then the faint impression of another sound just beneath hearing. Not voices this time, but movement, breathing, rocking. One listener from Kent claimed he heard knocking on his bedroom wall after playing it. A journalist who visited the site of the old village in 2018 recorded nothing but silence. Yet when she returned home and played back her footage, the sound began halfway through the file. 3 notes, followed by a soft woman's voice saying, "Thank you for bringing them home." That same year, construction workers uncovered the remnants of Coldbridge Bridge during a drainage project. Buried beneath the silt, perfectly preserved, was a cradle made of oak. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a dozen small wooden boxes. Each bore a carved spiral. Inside the lid of one, faint but legible, were the initials AW. The boxes were taken to a museum in Hawley for conservation. But by the next morning, the staff refused to enter the storeroom. They claimed to hear knocking coming from inside the display cases, soft and rhythmic, the sound of something that wanted to be let out. The museum sealed the room, citing chemical instability in the materials. Officially, the boxes were never opened. Unofficially, 2 curators resigned within the month, both citing recurring dreams of a woman standing by the river with a lantern, whispering over the water. Today, the remains of Coldbridge are fenced off, the ruins of St. Mary's half buried beneath moss and thyme. Yet hikers still report the same phenomenon when passing near the site, faint lullabies carried on the wind, and a warmth that seems to pulse through the soil, like the heartbeat of something vast and sleeping. Locals say it is only the echo of the old recordings rebounding through the valley, but others believe the sound was never recorded at all, that it existed long before tape, long before words, a rhythm carved into the bones of the earth itself. And if you stand on the bridge at dusk, when the light fades and the mist drifts low, you might hear it too, a soft hum rising from below the water, carrying 3 familiar notes, the first for the children, the second for the mother, the third for the promise she never broke, then silence. But if you wait long enough, if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, another voice will answer, faint, grateful, eternal. "We are home now.